Hello, everybody, and welcome to our bonus module in Powerful Bible-Based Preaching. In today's bonus module, I am going to share with you how to plan your preaching year. That's right, we are actually going to learn today how to plan 12 months of sermons in advance. Originally, this presentation was being recorded to share with my church elders, but I figured that we don't have a module planned for December, and this is applicable to everyone who's learning how to preach, so I thought I would share it with you all as well. Now, the presentation is based really on two different books. That is the book Engage by Nelson Searcy and the book Planning Your Preaching by Stephen Rummage. Now, this presentation is only going to skim the surface of these two books, so if this is something you want to know more of, I would highly encourage you to buy those two books, Engage by Nelson Searcy and Planning Your Preaching by Stephen Rummage. I will place Amazon links down in the description if you would like to purchase them that way. So let's begin. How do you plan your preaching year? Well, to begin with, I think it is important that we understand why planning your preaching year is so important. The first reason why I think planning your preaching is so important is that it provides your congregation a balanced biblical diet. Let's be honest with one another for a moment. As preachers, whether we're pastors or elders or lay pastors, there are certain topics that we like to talk about, right? We're really passionate about certain things. Maybe we're very educated in certain areas, and so we want to share that with the congregation at large. Now, there's nothing wrong with being passionate about certain things. The problem is that we generally gravitate toward those things. And so our congregations become very educated in those certain topics, but the other topics are neglected. It's like a bodybuilder who is just trying to work out their biceps and triceps. By the time they get done, they're going to have some killer looking upper arms, but the rest of their muscles will atrophy. It's the same when it comes to preaching. If we only cover certain topics, yes, our congregations will be very deep in those topics, but they will be stagnant in other areas. By planning your Bible preaching a year in advance, you can ensure that they have a balanced Bible diet. The second benefit of planning your preaching year is it allows you to give thematic, creative services. If you already know what you're preaching in advance, you can make sure that every aspect of the service is geared toward your theme. You can bring the prayer time, the children's story time, the testimony time. Everything can be themed. The music, the hymns, they are all themed under what you're preaching that day. And that allows you to really preach with power. The whole service has power because it's laser focused on one specific theme. The third benefit I believe that comes from preaching, knowing you're preaching for the year, is that you are able to lead from the pulpit. There's no more powerful way for an elder, a pastor, or a lay pastor to lead than doing so from the pulpit. It is at the pulpit that you are going to gain momentum. It is at the pulpit that you're going to be able to push your congregation forward in the way that you want them to grow. So if you know your vision for the upcoming year, you can tailor your preaching calendar to accomplish that vision. For example, if one of your goals for the year is to increase ministry participation by 20%, then you're going to want to have sermon series in the preaching year that are advocating why people should serve. You should be talking about the priesthood of all believers, how everyone has a ministry, how everyone is called by God. You should be preaching about spiritual gifts and how to find those in the church. When you know your goals for the year, you can then put them in your preaching calendar, and so you're actually leading from the pulpit. The fourth benefit that comes from knowing your preaching year is it helps you to preach in an evangelistic cycle. I'm going to teach you momentarily a certain way to structure your preaching that allows you to bring people from the community to the church and then deepen them in Adventist truth. And when you do this correctly, the entire preaching year itself functions as a way to bring people to the church and to connect them to the Adventist mission. So those are the 4 reasons I believe you should be planning your preaching calendar in advance. So now let's get down to the nuts and the bolts. How do you actually do it? To be honest with you, it's not as difficult as it may seem. Ultimately, what you're going to do is this. You are going to brainstorm several 4 to 8 week sermon series. Once you've brainstormed them all, you are going to link them together in a certain order that gives you momentum and impact. In the end, you are going to plan 6 to 8 sermon series, place them all together, and you will have a preaching year. So what should those sermon series look like? Well, I believe that there are 3 categories that you should be looking at when planning your preaching calendar. The first is you should have sermon series that focus on felt needs. These are your sermon series that are going to attract people. The second category you should be looking at is discipleship series. These are the sermon series that are going to deepen people. And the last category you should be looking at are theological sermon series. These are the sermon series that are going to root the people in true Adventist Bible-based doctrine. So let's look at that first category a little bit together, the felt needs category. I would recommend that you should plan at least 2 felt needs sermon series for your preaching year. And these series are meant to attract people from the community or other churches to your church. So that means that the felt needs sermons, they need to focus on where people are hurting. You should focus on an area with people where they actually are feeling the pain. That will help you bring them to the church. Now, sometimes people get a little weary when it comes to talk about felt needs sermons. They think they're shallow, or they think that felt needs means that you ignore Adventist distinctives. That's not true at all. Those concerns can be legitimate, especially when you are looking at the seeker-sensitive movement. But done correctly, felt needs sermon series are neither shallow nor do they ignore Adventist distinctives. In fact, one of the most beautiful things about Adventism is that it really hits people in the nitty-gritty of life. In fact, many of our distinctive doctrines focus on felt needs. Let me give you an example. One of my churches, we gave a sermon series called Stress Busters. And in Stress Busters, it was a felt needs sermon series where we focused on how people can eliminate stress. We talked about how diet and exercise was a way to reduce stress, how being out in nature was a way to reduce stress, how taking a day off every week could reduce stress, how surrendering your anxieties to God allowed you to reduce stress. Now, if you noticed, those are all coming from the 8 laws of health. It is neither shallow, nor does it ignore Adventist distinctives. In fact, we took Adventist distinctives and we framed it in a way that appealed to the stress that people were facing. So you want to plan 2 sermon series a year that focus on the felt needs. The second category you want to look at is the discipleship category. Now, this is the category that deepens people. And I would recommend that you look at two different areas when it comes to discipleship. You should look at equipping people with a skill to do ministry, and you should look at deepening their spiritual life. So, for example, you may want to preach an 8-week series on Christ's method alone that Ellen White talks about in Ministry of Healing, page 143. That would be an equipping series that would be teaching people how to share their faith in winsome ways with people around them. You also may want to deepen them in their spiritual life, and so you may preach a 9-week sermon series on the fruit of the Spirit, or you may preach a 6-week sermon series on the different spiritual disciplines found in the book Steps to Christ. But notice the differences in those two categories. One equips people with a skill, the other one deepens them in their spiritual life. And again, I would recommend that you do between 2 to 3 discipleship series every single year. The third category that we want to look at is theological. And the theological sermon series, they are what root people in correct Bible doctrine. When it comes to theological sermon series, I would recommend that you look at two different areas as well. You want to look at Adventist doctrine. There's nothing wrong with taking time to preach on specific doctrinal truths. You may have a sermon series on the sanctuary or on the Sabbath doctrine. Another thing you should do with theological sermon series are go through portions of books of the Bible or even entire books of the Bible. You may want to do like a 12-week series through the book of James or Philippians. You may want to do an 8-week series through John 14 through 17. And when you look at it this way, what you are doing, you're deepening people in the doctrine and you're taking them through the journey of the Bible. And when you do that, you can do books from the New Testament as well as portions of books from the Old Testament. So this is a really good way of rooting people. Now, what you want to do, this is where we get into more of the nuts and bolts as well. How you want to arrange this sermon series is you want to do a felt needs sermon series, followed by a discipleship sermon series, and follow that up with a theological sermon series. When you structure it that way, you have an evangelistic cycle through your preaching. Your felt needs sermon series brings people in. Your discipleship sermon series helps people taste and see that the Lord is good. And then the theological sermon series shows people the power of the Adventist truth. So now that we know the benefits of the preaching calendar, now that we know what kind of sermon series you are creating, how do you pull it all together? Well, we'll walk you through a step-by-step thing at this time. Step number 1, this is easy. You want to print a calendar. You can print a weekly calendar. You can just do an easy calendar where it lists the month and the Sabbaths, whatever is best for you. If you purchase that book, Planning Your Preaching by Rummage, he actually has worksheets in there that you can use to print off and plan your preaching year. And he has that you're preaching like 4 times a week, which is from his Pentecostal tradition. I think he's Pentecostal at least. But in that tradition, you preach 4 times a week. Adventists, maybe twice, right? So it's going to be a little more extensive than what most of you will need, but you can still use it to plan the Sabbath sermon. So once you have your worksheets laid out, once you have the calendar in front of you, your next step is to list out any holidays that you're going to focus on. Are you going to preach about Mother's Day? Are you going to preach about Father's Day, Veterans Day, Memorial Day? Are you going to preach Thanksgiving? Are you going to preach about Christmas or Easter? You need to know those things in advance because you either, 1, need to include them in your sermon series, or number two, understand that they are going to be standalone sermons. So you need to place those in the calendar in advance. The next thing you want to do is you want to schedule any church ordinances. These are things such as communion. They may be special events from the conference. One of my churches is very big on following the conference calendar. When the conference is doing a Sabbath on domestic abuse, my church wants to follow it. Well, you need to know that in advance, because again, you need to either plan that as part of the sermon series, do that as a standalone sermon, or bring in a guest speaker. But you need to know what days those fall on in advance so you can plan appropriately. You also want to include any other calendars that may impact the preaching. If you have a school at your church, that calendar is going to impact your preaching on certain times. I remember my first church ever. It was a small church with a small school, but I knew that I would be preaching for graduation. I knew that I would be preaching during the Christmas pageant. I knew that we'd have a welcome Sabbath on the first day of school where we'd welcome everybody to the church and make them know that they are part of the family. I knew that. And so those things had to go on my preaching calendar. What about Pathfinders? Do you have them at your church, and do they require any preaching from you? What about the conference calendar? Is that going to impact your preaching in any way? You need to know what way these other calendars will impact because you can plan accordingly. So by now you should have all the holidays planned. You should have the ordinances planned. You should have the other calendars, school, Pathfinders, conference, what have you. All of that should now be on the calendar. Once that is done, you can begin putting down your sermon series. I would recommend the first time following the cycle I recommended earlier. Felt needs, followed by discipleship, followed by theological. And you should be able to cycle through that, depending on the length of your series, 2 to 3 times a year. It really is that simple. Really, 2 to 3 times a year, you should be able to cycle through that. Now, sometimes, you're not going to go exactly one series for felt needs, then discipleship, then theological. You can toy with it a bit, but I would recommend doing it at least once that way for the year to get used to the format before you begin toying with it. So I would recommend something along the following lines. January and February, you should be doing some sort of felt needs series. Through March and April, you should be doing some sort of discipleship series. And then May to June, you should be doing some sort of theological series. And then you're just going to rinse and repeat, right? July to August, felt needs. September to October, discipleship. And then November to December, you can do something theological. And by doing that, you cycle through that format twice a year, and you're able to preach deep sermon series. But what you're going to find is as you plug those in those months, there are going to be a few gaps. That's fine. That's perfectly okay. If you ever go on Loma Linda University, right on their app, and you look at Randy Roberts' sermons, you will see that he has sermon series for the year, and he also has standalone sermons for the year. The best preachers do it. Derek Morris does it. Dwight Nelson does it. Henry Wright did it. Not as much, to be honest. He was really good at keeping those sermon themes going for the whole year, but even he has standalone sermons. Okay? So as you plug in your series, you're going to look down at your calendar and be, there's a week or two where we don't have anything planned. Well, you can put in a 2-part series or just do some stand-alone series. So that is how you plan your preaching year. You look at the felt needs of the congregation and the community. You look at how you want to deepen them in discipleship. What skill do they need? What spiritual life aspects should they grow in? And what theology do they need to be rooted in? You plug them into your preaching calendar, and before you know it, you have an entire preaching year. I thank you all for joining me for this bonus module. I hope it was a blessing to you. I invite you to join us again in January, where we are going to be bringing in another guest professor to teach you how to structure and outline your sermon for maximum impact. This is Pastor Sean Kelly signing off. Thank you so much for joining us, and may the Lord thoroughly bless you as you continue to preach powerful Bible-based sermons. Take care, my friends, and may you have a marvelous day.